Hi everybody and welcome to our apprenticeship service webinar. My name's Nick Duff from the service engagement team and I'll be hosting today's session. So today we're going to be looking at the apprenticeship funding rules for 2026-2027 and this webinar is for both employers and training providers, and we're expecting that we're going to last for about 60 minutes today. We did run a similar session on the apprenticeship unit funding rules just over a month ago. And if you didn't manage to dial into that, we've got a recording that we put up onto our YouTube channel, so you can listen back to that if you're interested. Also, when you registered for today's webinar and also for the apprenticeship units funding rules session as well, you may well have spotted some questions about off-the-job training. We put those into the registration questions so that we could design an off-the-job training webinar based on your comments, and we plan to release that webinar in July. And can I say a big thank you to all of those that took the time to share your insights when you registered for today's session. Before we start properly, I'll do my usual reminder and just say that the webinar is being recorded, and remind you all that by registering and attending today, you're giving your consent and that you're agreeing for the webinar to be both recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel. But if you feel that you've changed your mind regarding that consent, can I please ask that you dial off? As for the recordings of this session and our previous sessions, I'll tell you how you can access those a little bit later on towards the end of the webinar. Hopefully you'll all notice that you've automatically been placed on mute and you'll stay on mute for throughout the session. Just so you know as well, it's our usual practice for our webinars for us not to be on camera whilst we're talking. That's because we've got a really big numbers of people that join the sessions, and we've got some worries about potential bandwidth issues as well. And this is especially relevant today, as you know we're expecting quite significant numbers of attendees to join us. So sorry, but you won't be getting to see the faces of our lovely presenters today. So our plan is that we're going to run through the apprenticeship funding rules for 26-27, and we're going to focus in particular on the key changes to the rules this coming year. And we won't be able to reference every change that's been made in the rules, but we'll certainly cover all of the main topic areas. And then after we've done that and we've covered off those main topic areas, we'll go into a Q&A session. And then just to add to the fun for today, for our webinar, the platform provider is trialing a new attendee interface, and we're not sure which one you're going to be seeing. So I've got a couple of slides that are coming up just to show you how to access the handout for today's session and how you answer questions. The handout has all the key links that we'll be referring to during the session. Yeah, so click on, we've gone on to the next slide already. Excellent, cool. So for the handouts, for those of you that are seeing the classic view, like in the image on the left-hand side of the screen, you can now download the handout from the control panel that's on the screen under the Handouts tab. For those of you that have got the new interface, you'll find the handout by clicking on the Materials tab in the control panel, and you can see an example of that on the right-hand side of your screen. And you may get a choice, if you've got that new interface, you may get a choice of either light mode or dark mode on that view as well. So the handout has, as I mentioned, has all the links that we'll be referring to today, and also places to go for you to access support, and so you can download that now. As for questions, again, the classic mode is shown on the left hand side of the screen, and the new interface is on the right hand side of the screen. If you've got any questions for the presenters today, it's the same process, whatever your view. So just go to the control panel, click on questions and pop them in there. And we're expecting lots of questions, but we'll try and cover as many of them as we can during the webinar. And if we don't cover each question, we'll certainly cover most of the main or all of the main points that you raised during the Q&A. And then what we'll do is we'll take away all the questions, including those that we haven't been able to answer, and we'll put together some points of clarification and send those out to you by email in a couple of weeks' time. But also our funding policy team will also review all of the questions and comments that you make, and they will take your thoughts and insights into account as they continue to review and update the rules. We won't cover any questions that don't relate to the topic today, and if you've got any queries about how the rules get applied in specific circumstances that are likely to be unique to you, I'd prefer it if you don't ask those questions in the webinar, but raise those through our support desk. And I'll give you the details of how to access the support desk again later in the webinar. One other thing to note about the new interface, if you're seeing that view, is that you can also access live captioning from the webinar if you need to, and the slides will show you where to go. Yeah, the slide on the right hand side shows you where to go to access those live captions. Okay, one last point about questions, if I can. We're expecting that there's going to be quite a few questions today about the new apprenticeship hiring payments. So could you do me a favor? If you've got a question about the apprenticeship hiring payment, can you prefix your question with the phrase hiring payment? Because what we're going to try and do is when we go to the Q&A session, we're going to try and look at those questions first. And it will really help me if you prefix with hiring payment, then I can filter them and we'll be able to sort questions to be able to deal with those all in one go at the beginning of the Q&A session. And then one last point about our webinar domestics. When you get to the end of today's webinar, as you leave, we always automatically point you to a survey. So if you can take a few moments to answer a couple of quick questions about what you thought about today's webinar on the exit survey. Okay, today I'm joined by John Myers, Laura Orritt-Hopkins, Karen Clark, Kate McDonough, Seb Aslam and Ambrish Patel, and they're from our apprenticeship funding policy team, and they're going to be doing the main input on the rules. And then we've also got Sam Miller, who's a product manager in the apprenticeship service, who'll pitch in with support on the Q&A panel. So welcome to all of you guys, and I think we're ready for you to start. So John, I'm coming to you to do your intro.
Thanks very much, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Can I start, first of all, by thanking the team for all of their hard work in publishing the funding rules. The funding rules were published on Monday of this week. So you've had a couple of days to look at them. Hopefully you'll be able to digest what they say, and that will help you to inform the questions that you ask a bit later. If we can move on to the next slide, please, Nick. So, as ever, we try to improve our funding rules each year. Your feedback is really important to us at every time of the year, actually, but particularly now in terms of helping us to define how we need to improve the rules further going forward. Obviously, each year we incorporate new policy changes. They form the bulk of the main changes this year as well, as ever. Nick has already mentioned the hiring payment, which will be something you'll all be very interested in and is a key policy change. And we are a couple of weeks later than we would like to be in publishing the rules. As I say, we published them on 15th of June. Normally we'd like to publish them at the end of May. That was because we were waiting to have as much information as we could around the operation of the hiring payment to be able to inform you about that. There are a couple of other changes that we do anticipate making to the rules, which we weren't able to incorporate in the 15th of June update. So I would expect that if and when those are resolved, we'll be producing a further update to the rules as soon as we possibly can. And one of the things you'll also have picked up in reading the rules so far is how we're going to review our work around subcontracting, our rules around subcontracting. So that will be another thing which we'll be looking to update. Well, that will be in the new year. The summary of changes document, which is downloadable from the website, .gov website, tells you about all the changes that we're making this year. If you could move us on, please, Nick. So today we're going to cover a number of areas. I've already mentioned the hiring payment. That'll be of great interest to you. Obviously important we get off on the right foot with that, starting 1st of October. So it's really important that we let you know about the rules around that. Then some more things you're more familiar with: initial assessment and program eligibility. The price of an apprenticeship, obviously, there's been a number of changes this year around, for example, the defunding of level 7 and only funding young people for business administration. Subcontracting, I've mentioned already. Some changes there. We have paused most of the changes we were making in our draft. Very much listened to the feedback that we've had on the draft, and that's why we chose to pause those changes and to have a more fundamental review. Another key area of change is around the English and Maths and employer co-investment. Again, two key areas to have a look at. Some change in learner eligibility to the detail, but very important that and understand what change we're proposing around learner eligibility as well. So I'll now hand over to Laura, who's going to take us through the rest of the rule changes along with the rest of the team.
Thank you, John. So I'm Laura Orritt-Hopkins. I'm one of the senior managers in the funding policy team, and I'm going to start by covering the new apprenticeship hiring payment for non-levy employers. I can see lots of questions coming in about that already, but hopefully some of those questions might be covered off in terms of what I'm about to say. So this first slide just sets out some of the background to the new hiring payment. And we've included the details for those rules in version 1 that we published on Monday. I'm not going to sort of read the slide, but whilst it's on the screen, I just wanted to say that we do appreciate that the rules for the hiring payment were not included in the draft version that we published in April. And so we appreciate that this is the first time you've seen these rules. And therefore, we are expecting that we will receive questions. Please do ask any questions today, as Nick said. We're going to look at those, I think, first in the Q&A a bit later. But if we can't answer them today, we will take them away and we can issue further clarifications if needed. As John mentioned, we are anticipating having to issue an update to the rules fairly soon, so we can always make further clarifications in that version if we need to. But saying that, we also know that employers in particular are keen to understand the sort of specific eligibility criteria in particular around the new payment and how this will be applied. And so we've included as much detail as we can at this stage in this version of the rules. Can I have the next slide, please, Jazz? Thank you. So this slide sets out the confirmed eligibility criteria for the new hiring payment. And these are set out in the rules that we published on Monday. So the first part of this criteria is that the employer needs to be a non-levy payer. And then there are also a number of other things that need to be met for the employer to be eligible. So the first thing to say is that the apprentice needs to be aged between 16 and 24 years old at the start of their apprenticeship training. And that's important because we're obviously looking at the apprentice being a new employee. But if they start their job, for example, when they're 24 years old, but then they turn 25 before they start their actual apprenticeship training, then they wouldn't be eligible for that payment. So the age criteria is applied at the start of the apprenticeship training. The start of the apprenticeship training date, or the practical period as we also call it, must be on or after the 1st of October 2026. So anybody that starts their apprenticeship training prior to the 1st of October wouldn't be eligible. It's really important that the apprentice is included in the PAYE scheme that's been added to the employer's apprenticeship service account that's being used to fund that apprentice. And there are also some rules around not being employed by their employer for more than 90 days prior to their practical period or their apprenticeship training start date. I wanted to make a couple of points on this particular criteria. So we previously used the phrase 3 months in terms of the time between the employment start date and the training start date. In some of the initial comms that was put out around the announcement, it was sort of 3 months that we were referring to. But to describe this more accurately in terms of how the check will work, we are now referring to 90 days. So there can be no more than 90 days between the apprentice's employment start date and the date that the apprenticeship training starts for that apprentice to be eligible. And then the second point I wanted to make around that was that in the initial announcements about the new payment, we said that apprentices who start their job from the 1st of July would be eligible as long as they start their training on the 1st of October. I just wanted to point out that actually the 1st and the 2nd of July are actually more than 90 days from the 1st of October. But we can confirm that apprentices who start their job on the 1st or 2nd of July will still be eligible for the payment as long as they start their training on the 1st of October. Could I have the next slide, please, Jazz? So this slide sets out the detail around the payments. So the principle for these payments is that they will, in the main, mirror the approach we use for the existing additional payments for providers and employers. And this also includes similar evidence requirements around providers evidencing the payments that they make to the employer. Payments will be made via the provider, and employers won't need to actually claim for them. We will validate the eligibility of the apprentice in terms of being a new employee within the previous 90 days, and we'll be doing that by validating HMRC PAYE data against data that we receive through the ILR. So payments will be made in 2 instalments. So the employer will be eligible for 50% of the payment after the apprentice has been in learning for 90 days. And then the remaining 50%, they'll be eligible for that after the apprentice has been in learning for 365 days. I just wanted to touch on durations. Where the apprentice is on a shorter apprenticeship, that's where the published typical duration of the apprenticeship standard is less than 12 months. Or on a foundation apprenticeship, the second instalment will be generated at 242 days after the apprentice's learning start date instead of the 365 days. But also important to highlight that if the apprentice is on a standard where the typical duration is 12 months or more, but they complete their apprenticeship in less than 12 months, then they wouldn't be eligible for that final instalment. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over to Karen for the next slide, but obviously we can return to this in the questions session a bit later.
Thanks, Laura. Just next slide, Jazz, please. Okay, so on initial assessment, there's just a couple of changes that I wanted to pull out and mention. So in the recognition of prior learning area, we had been asked if the skills scan could also be done against a training plan rather than the individual case phase of the standard. So provided the training plan has been mapped to the standard, we've confirmed that the initial assessment can be done in this way. The other rule we've strengthened in this section is the link between the job role and the apprenticeship. And you might have seen some media attention on this recently. So we want to stress again the importance of this link. The completion of the apprenticeship should result in occupational competence for the core job role. And that's really important, that link. Next slide, please. So moving on to programme eligibility, there's a few things to cover here. So the first one is about non-mandatory qualifications. And that's non-mandatory qualifications that are at a different level to the standard. So in the draft rules, we said that a higher level non-mandatory qualification mustn't be used against the lower level standard. And we got quite a bit of feedback on this one. The majority of the feedback related to one specific level 6 standard, where a level 7 qualification was routinely being used. So we had a lot of discussion about this issue with Skills England, and we're both clear that the level of the standard should reflect the level of the KSBs within the standard, the knowledge, skills and behaviours. So for example, a level 6 standard will have level 6 KSBs. So because of that, we don't believe it's appropriate to use a level 7 non-mandatory qualification for a level 6 standard, because it's over and above the requirements of the standard. Because that was the level we were most concerned with, and because of all of the feedback we got, the rule in version 1 has been updated slightly and targeted at this level specifically. So there has been a change there, just to call out the level 6-7 specifically. On the wages section, We removed the line that used to say if an employer doesn't pay the apprentice a lawful wage, the provider is ineligible to receive funding. Now, we removed that because some providers had interpreted that as a requirement to constantly evidence the wage that was being paid. So they were collecting pay slips, for example, and that's never really been the intent of that section. So the intent of the section is that at the start of the programme, we would expect all providers to confirm with the employer that they're paying a lawful wage and get that in writing. So you can either do that as part of the training plan or you can do it as part of the contract for services. Now, clearly, if the employer's not willing to sort of commit to that at that point, we wouldn't expect the programme to go ahead. Now, we are continuing to develop our data checks in this area. So what the rule now says in version 1 is if you are subsequently made aware, either by the learner, maybe in a progress review, or by us telling you that it's not happening, that the employer is not complying with the national minimum wage, then we would expect you to act on that by withdrawing the learner from the programme. So that is a change for version 1. In the training plan bit, we said in the draft rules, we'd added that the training plan had to include a place for parties to confirm that the content of the plan had been fully delivered. And we received a few comments on that to say that that had already been included in the provider's gateway processes. So it was kind of duplication, which obviously we don't want. So we've confirmed in version 1 that that sign off can be done either in the training plan or as part of gateway, whatever's easier. And then finally on this slide on progress reviews need to take place at least every 3 calendar months, unless there's an evidence delivery reason, such as module length, that means an alternative frequency is more appropriate. So we've said that for a while now, and you have to agree the alternative frequency with the employer. But whilst we were doing the draft funding rules, we had received a few queries about what the maximum length in between reviews could be. So what was the outer limit? And we didn't have an outer limit in the funding rules for those alternative reviews. So in the draft rules, we added a 6-month reference as the outer limit. Now, the feedback we got said that that was too long. People generally didn't agree with that. But if we had removed the 6-month reference, we would have been back to the situation where we didn't have a clear outer limit in the rules, which isn't helpful either. So we have left the 6-month reference in. Obviously, if you're agreeing an alternative to the standard 3 months with an employer and you think that 6 months is too long, then by all means make that gap smaller. So this isn't about saying that 6 months is where we think it should be set. This is basically saying that 6 months or anything more than 6 months is not acceptable. Moving on, please. So I'm going to move on to the price of an apprenticeship section, which I know comes later in the funding rules, but it's just so that we could get all of the speakers' slides together. So when we asked the sector what areas of the rules were most problematic, this section always comes up a lot. So we had a good look at this section and made a number of changes in the draft, all of which have been kept for version 1. So I just want to kind of go through some of them. So in the contract for services, we made 2 key changes. First, we said that the price in the contract for services could now be at programme level rather than learner level. All learner level pricing and any subsequent changes to that initial price will be managed through the ILR and then consequently the apprenticeship service. And that means the contract documentation is really just a place where you can agree the headline price or the funding band for the programme with the employer, and where you describe to the employer any co-investment policy that might be applicable. We also removed the need to break down the price into the 5 eligible cost areas. Now, the intent of both of those changes is to reduce the number of contractual updates that you're making and to reduce the amount of change that you need to do to get signatures. That's always been fed back to us, that's been the biggest problem, kind of getting those changes agreed. So that's why we've done those 2 changes. Moving on to TMP2 on the ILR, we provided further information in the draft around the use of TMP2 estimates. So we know that there's rarely a fixed price for endpoint assessment at the start of a programme, and that's why we've always had a rule in place that says to leave TMP2 blank until a price is confirmed with the endpoint assessment organisation. But we understand why providers don't typically want to leave the field blank and prefer to use an estimate. But the quality of these estimates has been really variable, and that was fed back to us by our audit colleagues. So what we said in the draft and also in version 1 is that these estimates must be based on credible evidence. So for example, An auditor will accept that you've based the price on a current price list, for example, but they won't accept a TMP2 estimate that's been based on a blanket 20% of the funding band. So that must not be used, the sort of blanket 20%. Where providers are using an estimate, we've confirmed that the price only needs to be updated once, and that's when the price is agreed in writing with the endpoint assessment organisation, and there's no requirement to update the field at any other time. I think what was happening was that people were updating the field annually, but we don't need to see those annual updates. And then lastly, in the apprenticeship service, we've removed the need for the employer to approve a different split between TMP 1 and 2. So for example, if the original split was 8,000 for TMP 1 and 2,000 for TMP 2, so a total price of 10, but then changed to a split of 9 and 1, the employer only needs to approve a price change where the total price increases. So if it increased more than 10, for example, they don't need to approve it where it's just a different split. So that change applies to new starts, and we've also made it so it applies to continuing learners, but only where the price change occurs on or after the 1st of August. So if the price changes now, it's the 25-26 funding rules that apply, but obviously if the price changes after the 1st of August, it's 26-27 funding rules that apply. Moving on to next slide. So my final two slides are on subcontracting. And what I want to do is give a bit of context to the changes that we proposed in the draft, what changes we've kept in version 1 and what we're planning next for this area. So the first change is about removal of the term on-programme assessment. So that was part of the term training and/or on-programme assessment. And that term has been used for a long time in the funding rules. But as you know, we've got a set of endpoint assessment reforms that are currently being worked through at the moment. And those reforms will allow some of what was previously the endpoint assessment to be carried out during or on the programme. So we felt keeping the term on programme assessment, which has a different definition currently in 25-26, would be really confusing, which is why we've removed it. The other reason we've removed that term is that it was brought to our attention, again from our audit colleagues, that we had several training providers who weren't delivering any training at all, just assessment. So technically currently compliant with the 25-26 rules because it is an and/or statement, provided all of the other rules can be met, obviously. But we didn't feel it's in the spirit of the policy. We expect all training providers to deliver training. And from the 1st of August, the rules will obviously require that. The second change I want to talk about in subcontracting is the APAR exemption for supporting providers. So you might remember that this was introduced back in 24-25. It's often referred to as the £100,000 de minimis. Basically, this exemption allows providers who have achieved the subcontracting standard to use an organisation that's not on APAR as a subcontractor. However, by restricting its use in this way, so by restricting it only to those providers who have the standard, it means that other providers, those that don't have the subcontracting standard, can't benefit or use the flexibility when selecting their subcontractors. And we wanted to extend that flexibility to other providers. So in the draft rules, what we said was that we initially proposed that we would introduce a second exemption set at a lower limit of 25,000, but this was one that all providers could use, irrespective of whether they had the subcontracting standard or not. And we actually got very limited feedback on that change. I suspect most people felt it was quite a good change because it allowed people to benefit from this APAR exemption, whereas previously it had been ring-fenced to people that just had the standard. But then during the feedback window, we thought about the practicalities a bit more, running two exemptions alongside each other. And we felt it could become a bit confusing, especially for the subcontractor. So in version 1, there has been a further change. We've gone back, instead of having the two APAR exemptions, we've gone back to just having the one, the original 100,000 de minimis, but we are going to open it up now to allow all providers to use it, irrespective of whether you've got the standard or not. So that's really opened that up to people now. So that should be a big benefit for everybody. Just a couple of more points before I move on. In this one, we did get asked about the appropriateness of the subcontractor, the person who's not on APAR, needing to have a UK PRN. We haven't changed our thinking on this because we feel a UK PRN helps us to identify that organisations are legitimate. So if your subcontractor can't meet this requirement, then obviously the exemption can't be used. The final thing I want to kind of just highlight here is that if you are using this exemption, the party that you're asking to deliver on your behalf is still considered to be a subcontractor, despite the fact that they're not on the register. So the subcontracting rules do still apply, including obviously declaring them on your declaration. And then moving on to my final slide. The next change that we made in the draft was the definition of a subcontractor. And I think it's fair to say that, we've had this definition for a number of years now, and it's resulted in quite a few audit issues, especially around the terminology of being directly managed and controlled, which is why in the draft funding rules we updated the definition. So that wasn't to change our policy position at all, but rather it was meant to be helpful. It was to have a set of words that were easier for everyone to understand, wording that wasn't open to as much interpretation, and to have a definition that clearly separated out who was and who wasn't a subcontractor. We also included in the glossary for the first time a definition of directly managed and controlled. Again, the meaning behind that was to be helpful, so that we all had the same understanding of the term. This area got a lot of feedback, especially around directly managed and controlled in relation to freelance provision. And our policy here hasn't changed. We've always regarded freelancers as subcontractors because they're not employees. They typically work through a contract for services like other subcontractors do, and they're paid off payroll through an invoice. But we fully understand that there hasn't been everyone's interpretation of the existing definition, against the 25-26 definition is what I mean by that. And we fully understand the need to use freelancers in the sector. Freelance provision, it's not only valuable, but I think it's vital. And we have a responsibility for public funding, and we need to understand where it goes and who it goes to. So that ultimately means that all subcontracting needs to be declared. Now, what we've done temporarily for version 1 is put the existing 25-26 subcontractor definition back in until we work through the subcontracting review. A new definition will be introduced, but this will be later in the year now. That won't be from the 1st of August. So that brings me back to the final bit, which is the subcontracting review. I think generally a lot of people feel that subcontracting or the rules around subcontracting have become really quite complicated. So the intent of this review, and it is just about apprenticeship subcontracting, is to go back to basics and look at everything. So the underpinning policy, the rules, the evidence requirements, how we monitor it, and all of the associated definitions. We will obviously include sector representatives in the review to help shape our thinking and the outcomes. Now, we plan to do the review over July and August, and we plan to report back by the end of September with any changes coming into effect from January. That timeline is still to be confirmed because obviously we don't know what the changes might look like at the moment. And so further details of the review will be made available in due course when we're a little bit further through it. And those updates will be made either through DFE updates. So if you don't subscribe to that, I would encourage you to subscribe to it, or through the representative bodies. So I think that's all from me. Now that's my final slide. So I'm going to be handing over to my colleague, Kate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. So the first change I wanted to highlight around support for English and maths training is clarifying that not all English and/or maths training can be delivered through self-directed learning. Now, this came on the back of queries and feedback that we received from the sector that apprentices needed more face-to-face tutor support with subject areas such as these. Further to this, we have also clarified that apprentices aged 19 plus who initially opt into English and maths may choose to withdraw at a later stage. So we've clarified that they may do this, and providers just need to withdraw to the last day of English and maths learning to ensure that they are only drawing down funds that are used to support this training. And the final point on this slide, we have clarified that where an employer does not want to opt in their apprentice who is aged 19 plus, the apprentice may choose to exercise their statutory entitlement to study English and maths by accessing training through the Adult Skills Fund, and this won't be counted as double funding. slide, please. So as part of the November 25 budget, the Chancellor announced the next phase of the Growth and Skills Levy offer, which included a package to support young people. This included fully funding apprenticeship training up to the funding band maximum for non-levy paying employers who take on eligible young people. This is the first time we are fully funding the cost of training eligible apprentices aged 16 to 24 with non-levy paying employers. So for starts from the 1st of August 2026, training and assessment will be completely free up to the band maximum for non-levy paying employers who hire these young people. These employers take on a high proportion of young apprentices, and so by supporting these organisations, we will be supporting opportunities for young people. Now, where the apprentice is aged 25 or above, the co-investment rate for non-levy employers will remain at 5%. For levy-paying employers, if employers commit to more training than their available levy balance can cover at any given time, then for starts from the 1st of August 2026, the employer co-investment rate will be 25%. Government will continue to cover 75% of the training and assessment costs once the funds are exhausted. Therefore, it remains important for employers to monitor their account to ensure sufficient funds are available when payments are due. The reason for this change is that it is right that employers who utilise all their levy funds contribute more to apprenticeship training and assessment. This will support greater employer investment in skills overall and ensure funding is available to roll out flexibilities for business, deliver important reforms, and increase opportunities for young people. But to note, for any starts prior to the 1st of August 2026, the co-investment rate will remain at 5%, meaning employers will continue to benefit from the 95% rate of government co-investment for existing apprentices that are currently on programme. Now, changes of employer may or may not affect the co-investment rate for the new employer. So we will be updating the Apprenticeship Technical Funding Guide in due course to cover these scenarios. I would also like to remind levy employers that the expiry period for levy funds will reduce from 24 months to 12 months. Currently, levy accounts can show large unspent balances, significantly higher than our annual apprenticeship budget, which has led to the misconception that there is significant unspent funding available. By changing the expiry period to 12 months, we can simplify the system and ensure levy balances are more closely aligned to the actual budget available. The new 12-month expiry period will only apply to funds entering accounts from August 2026 onwards. So any funds already in employer accounts before that date will continue to follow the 24-month expiry period. I'm now going to hand over to Seb.
Thanks very much, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to cover the updates we've made to learner eligibility. Firstly, I just wanted to say that following feedback from the sector, we're still looking at the requirement for learners to be able to complete their apprenticeship, including endpoint assessment, within the time available to them. So, for example, where a learner is here on a visa, providers and employers still need to know that there's sufficient time for the apprentice to fully complete their programme. This has not changed for version 1, but we are still considering this area and looking at all of the feedback that we've received. So there's more to do in that area. Secondly, we've made a change to simplify the rule that at least 50% of an apprentice's working hours needs to take place in England. Previously, this required that all the working hours were known about upfront and at the start of the apprenticeship. We've now removed that requirement, giving providers and employers more flexibility while still meeting the overall rule. So where the working hours aren't known about up front, the apprenticeship can still take place. Note that where all the working hours are known about up front, a provider can still collect evidence in the way that they did previously, but this flexibility means that in sectors where the hours aren't known about in advance, it's still possible for the learner to undertake the apprenticeship. Finally, we've included specific eligibility criteria for the new standard, the Level 2 Administration Assistant. This standard is only eligible for funding where the learner is aged 16 to 24 at the start of the apprenticeship, or where they're 15 and their 16th birthday falls between the last Friday in June and the 31st of August. That's it on individual eligibility. So I'll now hand back to Laura for the next section.
Thanks, Seb, and hi again, everyone. I just wanted to highlight one very specific clarification that we made in the Breaks in Learning section of the draft version of the rules. I've noticed some questions around this in the chat, so hopefully this will cover those off. But in the draft version of the rules that we published in April, we stated that where an apprentice is absent from work for medical reasons, they may continue with their apprenticeship. So this addition in the draft version of the rules was in response to some stakeholder feedback that we received and also some queries that we'd had. And it really was intended to be a positive change to aid scenarios where an apprentice is perhaps off sick from work on a longer term basis and usually would need a break in learning. But some of the feedback that we had indicated that it could be of benefit to the apprentice to be able to continue with their apprenticeship whilst they were on sick leave. So we popped that clarification into the draft. However, following the publication of that draft, we received a significant amount of queries and feedback on this area, and that led us to take in some further legal advice. And following that advice, we've decided to remove this clarification from version 1, mainly because it gives rise to all sorts of questions and complexity around matters relating to sort of employment law, to fit notes, to health, and it just felt like it was going to create more issues than it would solve. So we have removed that from version 1. That's all I wanted to cover on the Breaks in Learning section. So I'm now going to hand back to John, and he's going to cover the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, so as a number of colleagues have pointed out, there are some areas of the rules that we expect to do further work on, including subcontracting. We do expect a few other changes for our version 2, which we'll be looking to update as soon as we can, and certainly the subcontracting changes we'll be implementing in the new year. Alongside that, though, there are other things that we anticipate changing, or indeed other documents we expect to produce. So the apprenticeship unit rules will be updated again from the 1st of August. We are in the midst of updating the technical funding guides, which is sort of level below the funding rules, which really tell you about the full detail you need to understand for your systems to make the funding rules work for you. Also, policy documentation and further guidance. I would expect that we will be updating our guidance around the hiring payment. There are a few things we still need to iron out there, and your feedback on this area today will be very helpful. So a further update, version 2, I would expect in the next couple of months, with version 3 potentially following in January around subcontracting. If you can move us on, Nick.
Okay, right. Massive thank you, John, Laura, Seb, Kate, and Karen, for all of your inputs today. Really, really comprehensive run through of the funding rules, and I think you've seen the amount of questions that are coming in for bits of clarification. That so big thank you to everybody that's put in those questions as well. So we've got a big job to do in about 15 minutes left. So let's have a look. So we'll start with the hiring payments then, if we can. And thank you everybody for prefixing your questions with hiring payments. This has made it much simpler to filter. Excellent job with that. So John, first question I've got is for you. Why is this starting in October? Most recruits happen in August and September.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the hiring payment is a very important payment. We want to ensure that as many employers as possible can access it. Of course, the announcement around the hiring payment was only made in spring, in March, and we've run as fast as we possibly can in order to be able to implement this very important change. Clearly, we need to get our systems in place. I think it's really important that we ensure we minimise bureaucracy for employers here, and I'm really pleased that we're able to do that, and that employers won't have to put their hand up to claim this funding. It will be done automatically, which is very important, as it's really key that we understand who the new starts are to the SMEs. Have to be new starters to a payroll. Payroll information is going to be very important. That's something I would say to providers on the call, is that you talk to employers about making sure their payroll is correct. So it's largely about the implementation. So I think actually we've run as quickly as we possibly can. Announced in March, we're talking about this starting in October. We could have potentially delayed it a bit longer, but we wanted to implement it as quickly as we can. Recognise that some apprentices do start around September time. That may cause some difficulties for you in terms of employer comms, but fundamentally this was about us moving as quickly as we possibly can to try and get this implemented. We could have held it back till March, held it back till summer next year. We didn't want to do that. We wanted it to implement as soon as possible. So it's about how quickly we can implement this fundamentally.
Thank you, John. And there's been lots of questions about the hiring grant and asking for more information. There will be a comms and engagement campaign that's aimed at employers and providers, which will provide more details as we go through the next few months. So please do look out for all of that engagement activity. Sam, I think John's pointed to the automatic payments of the hiring payment. There's a question here that says particularly what triggers the payment. Is this program date, start date, practical period date set up on the ILR?
Hi, Nick. Thank you. It's Simon here, just from the Apprenticeship Service, just so people know who it is. So in terms of what triggers the payment, so we will use the apprenticeship start date that's agreed by both provider and employer, and then, as I think it was referenced to on the call, then we'll use kind of a days in learning count up until sort of 90 days into that person's apprenticeship. So that ULN, that learner, that apprentice on that particular apprenticeship, we'll use that day count, and once they have met the minimum number of days, which is 90 days for first payment, then we will process that first payment.
Thank you. Laura, a couple of questions for you if I can. Still around, obviously, hiring payments. Would a non-levy employer qualify for both the usual £1,000 additional payments as well as the new £2,000 hiring incentive payment as well when they're hiring an 18-year-old?
Yeah, so thanks, Nick. So essentially, the new hiring payment for non-levy employers is a separate product to the current additional payments. So if the employer is eligible for both those different payments, then they would receive both.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question here about the way an apprentice is funded, whether they're still eligible for the hiring payment. So in this case, the employer's non-levy, but the training costs are being paid for by a levy transfer from a levy-paying employer. So in that case, so with the apprentice with a non-levy employer paid for by a transfer, will they still be able to access the incentive?
Yes. So as long as that non-levy employer meets all of the other eligibility criteria that we've outlined, then even if they're funding that apprentice via a levy transfer, then they would be eligible for the payment. And there is a line that confirms that in the actual funding rules.
And I think we've covered this by talking about the fact that it's non-levy employers, so employers that don't pay the apprenticeship or growth of skills levy. This is where that payment is targeted. But there is a question specifically about, do levy paying employers not get to benefit from this as well?
So no, so this particular payment is only for non-levy paying employers. But of course, levy paying employers still can access the other additional payments.
Cool. Okay. Sam, a question for you, if I can. So will the employment start date information be gathered? So where will the employment start date information be gathered from? And they talk about their ILR or HMRC.
So we'll use the apprenticeship start date as trigger. So each apprenticeship is added onto the ILR, is matched through to a record on the apprenticeship service. So we'll use that data, and what we'll do is we will be using information from the ILR, such as the national insurance number and the apprenticeship start date, when the training has started, and then we'll be using ILR details, apprenticeship service details added by the employer, such as like PAYE scheme and the payroll information that we have on there. What we do is we match those details provided, like I said, on the apprenticeship service and in the ILR, and then we will use those and check against HMRC employment data with a defined date range. So we don't necessarily specifically get an employment start date, as you were, but what we would do is we check a range to see if an apprentice or a learner has been paid or has been employed within that specific date range that we set.
Okay, thank you. Laura, there's a question about the 90 days, but there was lots of questions about the 3 months, 12 weeks, 90 days thing.
Yeah.
But this is specifically about why does there need to be a 90 days on the PAYE beforehand, before they're eligible for this hiring grant?
Thanks, Nick. So I think there's some slight confusion there. So I appreciate it is confusing because we talk about 90 days a lot. So one of the eligibility criteria, or one of the principles for this new hiring payment, is that the apprentice needs to be a new employee. So what we're saying is that if the apprentice is employed by an employer, from their employment start date, they have 90 days to start their apprenticeship training in order to be eligible for this payment. So they don't need to have been employed for 90 days. They just need to make sure that they have only been employed for 90 days or less before they start their apprenticeship training. And that's about demonstrating that the apprentice is a new employee.
Okay, thank you. I think most of the other questions on hiring payments are repeats, as far as I can see. So I think if we can leave hiring payments now and go on to some of the other questions. And I just need to refine my place in the question queue, and we'll see where we go. Whilst we're doing that, just to say, there's been quite a few questions about can we get copies of the slides and or recordings of the session. We don't typically send out slides for each of the webinars that we do, but we are recording it. The recording will be available tomorrow on the webinar platform where you registered. It'll be closed to play tomorrow, but that'll be there, so you can go back and have a look at what people have said and the slides there, and it will be available on YouTube again in a few weeks' time. So if you or your colleagues want to revisit what we've said and revisit some of the slides, can I put you towards the recording, please? Karen, if I can come to you, there were quite a few questions around TMP1, TMP2 and changes, what would changes to TMP2, for example. Is there any specific clarity you can offer on what you said around that?
Well, I think it'll depend what the question is. I think kind of the biggest question we get is around the sort of filling in TMP2 when you don't know kind of what the price is. So it's like using an estimate. And I think kind of the feedback we've had, like I said, from audit colleagues, is people routinely use 20% of the funding band. And that's not really acceptable because it's not based on any sort of evidenced, reason why you would do that. The endpoint assessment typically is around between 8 and 12% of a funding band, not 20%. So yeah, we've provided additional information in the draft and in version 1 about what evidence we would expect to be used. So if you don't have a price list, you shouldn't return TMP2. I think I've just seen a question to say that technically TMP2 comes back as an error if you leave it blank. I think you actually have to put a 0 in it rather than blank, so I might have kind of misspoke there, but that's kind of what I meant, that you wouldn't put a value in it if you don't know what the value is. And like I said, the main changes we've made are on the contract side. The fact that really, a lot of those funding rules were put in place when, the service wasn't as developed as it is now, the apprenticeship service. And obviously the service and the ILR records all of the learner level detail and any subsequent changes. So really the need for a contract for services that shows prices and learner details and breakdowns is less than it would have been a few years ago. And that's why we've kind of removed a lot of those requirements, because we understood that people were obviously spending a disproportionate amount of time making all of those updates to contracts and then having to chase signatures to get changes agreed. And we agree that obviously the service captures all that stuff. So we don't need the contract to also do it. So yeah, I think we've made quite a lot of changes in that section. But obviously, if people have particular questions, just come back through the service desk to us.
Yeah, there were quite a few questions on subcontracting, I think, and I think you've addressed sort of most of those with the clarity you've just given there and the response you gave during the presentation. There's a couple of questions about sort of qualifications. Level 7, there's one, if I can, Karen, for you. Focus being mainly on level 7 quals being used for level 6 standard. Can a level 4 HNC be used as a knowledge for a level 3 standard? Can I ask you that question?
Yeah, I mean, technically, yes. We have pivoted in version 1 to, specifically target the rule now at level 6-7 because of the concern we've got at that level. Obviously, there's been a lot of funding change at level 7. And what we don't want is a qualification that would have been delivered to perhaps a level 7 standard being delivered against the wrong standard as a way of kind of continuing to access government funding. So that's why we've kind of pivoted towards that level in version 1. So technically, yes, a level 4 against a level 3 at the minute is fine. I think we've got some standards, for example, where Skills England had said there's a mandatory choice of a level 3 or 4 standard. So we're less concerned at that level, but was more concerned at the higher level because of the defunding decisions.
Yeah, and then one more, if I can ask you, Karen, and this is around off the job. It talks about the off the job guide and when is it going to be updated? The last update was October 23. I know we're going to get together to record a pre-recorded webinar on off the job, which we'll release in July. But is there any update on when guidance is going to be updated?
Yeah, I've got that in front of me. We're busy kind of working through an update to all of the collateral, so the training plan, the apprenticeship agreement, off the job guide, bringing everything sort of bang up to date, including logos. I know people have asked about logos, so because of obviously our shift to DWP, we will be using the HM government logo. It doesn't matter that you've got the DFE logo and the apprenticeship logo on things at the minute, that's fine. But obviously in due course, when we roll out new collateral, we would ask you to make the appropriate updates, but there's no need to panic right now about whether you've got the right logo or anything on things. But yeah, we will be updating everything.
Okay, thank you. And I'm running out of time massively here, so I'm just going to quickly flick through. Kate, one question for you, and this was around 30 days payment terms. Very tight for large organisations invoicing and making payments. Is there any likelihood that some flexibility can be added to this?
So the 30-day actually replicates the, I'm assuming this is in light of the hiring payment. So the 30 days replicates the same process that we use for the £1,000 additional payment. So providers would hopefully know that that employer is going to be eligible for the payment. Payments aren't made until 90 days, and it's obviously the next payment run after that. So they have got a period in order to obtain, I'm assuming it's bank details, etc. So yes, at the moment we're not looking to change that because we think there is potentially enough time to be able to collect all that detail.
Okay, thank you. Seb, I've got one question for you if I can. Is there any update on the non-UK EU apprentice needing a visa for the whole length of their apprenticeship?
Yeah, so as I touched on when I spoke, that the rule on this is currently remains the same, so that the learner has to have enough time remaining on their visa, but this is an area we are still actively looking at.
Okay, thank you very much. Listen, I think because of the timing, we're going to leave it there. I know we've not covered as many questions as we would have hoped to. If we'd have had a little bit more time, maybe we could have gone into a bit more detail, but we will certainly take them away. We'll have a look at them and we will issue some points of clarification and send those out to you by email in a couple of weeks' time. And thank you everybody for putting your questions and comments into the questions chat. It's really helpful, and they won't go to waste. We will be looking at them after the webinar. Okay, just moving on very quickly to wrap up. I'll just remind you about our YouTube channel at DFE Sector Comms. There's 3 playlists on there. A recording of today's session will be in the Apprenticeship Service webinar recording playlist. That'll be in about 2 or 3 weeks' time once we've gone through a sort of final edit and making it accessible. And this is where you can also find the recording of the Apprenticeship Units Funding Rules webinar that I mentioned earlier on. I know a few of you asked about that. There's also 2 other playlists on there that we support. All of the support videos covering the different functions of the apprenticeship service are in the Using the Apprenticeship Service playlist, and then videos created just to support the delivery of apprenticeships in general are available on the Apprenticeship Support playlist. And again, just a quick plug, subscribe to that channel and you click on the bell icon and you get alerts when new content is uploaded. And then my final slide is that so there's lots of links there as to where you can go to access support, and if you haven't downloaded the handout already, you can do that now. So you either go to the handouts tab or the materials tab, depending on which of you've got in your control panel. So ways to stay up to date are apprenticeships.gov.uk. It's a really great place for information about apprenticeships. Training provider colleagues, there's obviously the funding further education training provider community space, which is a peer-led discussion forum. To register for any future webinars, there's the link in there for you to follow, and by the end of this week we'll have so you'll have access to the recording of today's webinar from that link as well. That recording is going to be up there for about a month or so, and as I've already said, we'll be publishing the recording onto YouTube as well. And also, when we talked about the Off the Job pre-recorded webinar, the Off the Job webinar will be available during July, and it will be available from that webinar link as well. But we'll write out to people and let people know that that's available. If you've got specific queries, and I know a lot of you did about sort of how your account's set up and different things. So if you've got specific queries about the apprenticeship service, go to the self-service support tool, or you can email the support team as well, and their contact details are on the slide and the handout as well. And then finally, I've given you links to the Apprenticeship Funding Rules document, the Apprenticeship Unit Funding Rules document, the Skills England websites that you can find out more details about approved apprenticeship units and approved apprenticeships, and also the Apprenticeship Technical Funding Guidance as well. Wow, there's a lot of information that we've downloaded, lots of technical stuff, lots of acronyms that we've banded around. Thank you for staying with us through all of that. And thank you for engaging so well with that. So that's the end of our session. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the presenters for their insights. And as you leave, remember, you'll get the short survey. Please complete that. We'd love to know what you thought about today's session. So yeah, bye everybody. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.